My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. 3. Jeeves and the Hard-Boiled Egg. Sometimes of a morning, as I've sat in bed sucking down the early cup of tea and watched my man Jeeves flitting about the room and putting out the raiment for the day, I've wondered what the deuce I should do if the fellow ever took it into his head to leave me. It's not so bad now I'm in New York, but in London the anxiety was frightful. There used to be all sorts of attempts on the part of low blighters to sneak him away from me. Young Reggie Foljam, to my certain knowledge, offered him double what I was giving him, and Alastair Bingham Reeves, who's got a valet who had been known to press his trousers sideways, used to look at him, when he came to see me, with a kind of glittery hungry eye that disturbed me deucedly. Bally pirates! The thing, you see, is that Jeeves is so dashed competent. You can spot it even in the way he shoves studs into a shirt. I rely on him absolutely in every crisis, and he never lets me down. And what's more, he can always be counted on to extend himself on behalf of any pal of mine who happens to be to all appearances knee-deep in the bullion. Take the rather rummy case, for instance, of dear old Bicky and his uncle, the hard-boiled egg. It happened after I had been in America for a few months. I got back to the flat latish one night, and when Jeeves brought me the final drink, he said, "Mr. Bickersteth called to see you this evening, sir, while you were out." "Oh," I said. "Twice, sir. He appeared a trifle agitated." "What? Pipped?" "He gave that impression, sir." I sipped the whiskey. I was sorry if Bicky was in trouble, but as a matter of fact, I was rather glad to have something I could discuss freely with Jeeves just then, because things had been a bit strained between us for some time, and it had been rather difficult to hit on something to talk about that wasn't apt to take a personal turn. You see, I had decided, rightly or wrongly, to grow a mustache, and this had cut Jeeves to the quick. He couldn't stick the thing at any price, and I had been living ever since in an atmosphere of bally disapproval, till I was getting jolly well fed up with it. What I mean is, while there is no doubt that in certain matters of dress Jeeves's judgment is absolutely sound and should be followed, it seemed to me that it was getting a bit too thick if he was going to edit my face as well as my costume. No one can call me an unreasonable chappie, and many's the time I've given in like a lamb when Jeeves has voted against one of my pet suits or ties. But when it comes to a valet staking out a claim on your upper lip, you've simply got to have a bit of the good old bulldog pluck and defy the blighter. He said that he would call again later, sir. Something must be up, Jeeves. Yes, sir. I gave the mustache a thoughtful twirl. It seemed to hurt Jeeves a good deal, so I chucked it. "I see by the paper, sir, that Mr. Bickersteth's uncle is arriving on the Carmantic." "Yes?" "His Grace the Duke of Chiswick, sir." This was news to me, that Bicky's uncle was a duke. Rum, how little one knows about one's pals. I had met Bicky for the first time at a species of Beano or jamboree down in Washington Square, not long after my arrival in New York. I suppose I was a bit homesick at the time, and I rather took to Bicky when I found out he was an Englishman, and had, in fact, been up at Oxford with me. Besides, he was a frightful chump, so we naturally drifted together, and while we were taking a quiet snort in a corner that wasn't all cluttered up with artists and sculptors and what-not, he furthermore endeared himself to me by a most extraordinarily gifted imitation of a bull-terrier chasing a cat up a tree. But, though we had subsequently become extremely pally, all I really knew about him was that he was generally hard up, and had an uncle who relieved the strain a bit from time to time by sending him monthly remittances. "If the Duke of Chiswick is his uncle," I said, "why hasn't he a title? Why isn't he Lord What-not?" "Mr. Bickersteth is the son of his Grace's late sister, sir, who married Captain Rollo Bickersteth of the Coldstream Guards." Jeeves knows everything. "Is Mr. Bickersteth's father dead too?" "Yes, sir." "Leave any money?" "No, sir." I began to understand why poor old Bicky was always more or less on the rocks. To the casual and irreflective observer, if you know what I mean, it may sound a pretty good wheeze having a duke for an uncle, but the trouble about old Chiswick was that, though an extremely wealthy old buster, owning half London and about 5 counties up north, he was notoriously the most prudent spender in England. He was what American chappies would call a hard-boiled egg. If Bicky's people hadn't left him anything, and he depended on what he could prize out of the old duke, he was in a pretty bad way. Not that that explained why he was hunting me like this, because he was a chap who never borrowed money. He said he wanted to keep his pals, so never bit anyone's ear on principle. At this juncture the doorbell rang. Jeeves floated out to answer it. "Yes, sir. Mr. Wooster has just returned," I heard him say, and Bicky came trickling in, looking pretty sorry for himself. "Hello, Bicky," I said. "Jeeves told me you have been trying to get me. Jeeves, bring another glass, and let the revels commence. What's the trouble, Bicky?" "I'm in a hole, Bertie. I want your advice." "Say on, old lad." "My uncle's turning up tomorrow, Bertie." "So Jeeves told me." "The Duke of Chiswick, you know." "So Jeeves told me." Bicky seemed a bit surprised. "Jeeves seems to know everything." "Rather rummily. That's exactly what I was thinking just now myself." "Well, I wish," said Bicky gloomily, "that he knew a way to get me out of the hole I'm in." Jeeves shimmered in with the glass, and stuck it competently on the table. "Mr. Bickersteth is in a bit of a hole, Jeeves," I said, "and wants you to rally round." "Very good, sir." Bicky looked a bit doubtful. "Well, of course you know, Bertie, this thing is by way of being a bit private and all that." "I shouldn't worry about that, old top. I bet Jeeves knows all about it already. Don't you, Jeeves?" "Yes, sir." "Eh?" said Bicky, rattled. "I am open to correction, sir, but is not your dilemma due to the fact that you are at a loss to explain to His Grace why you are in New York instead of Colorado?" Bicky rocked like a jelly in a high wind. "How the deuce do you know anything about it?" "I chanced to meet His Grace's butler before he left England. He informed me that he happened to overhear His Grace speaking to you on the matter, sir, as he passed the library door." Bicky gave a hollow sort of laugh. "Well, as everybody seems to know all about it, there's no need to try to keep it dark. The old boy turfed me out, Bertie, because he said I was a brainless nincompoop. The idea was that he would give me a remittance on condition that I dashed out to some blighted locality of the name of Colorado and learned farming or ranching or whatever they call it at some bally ranch or farm or whatever it's called. I didn't fancy the idea a bit. I should have had to ride horses and pursue cows and so forth. I hate horses. They bite at you. I was all against the scheme. At the same time, don't you know, I had to have that remittance." "I get you absolutely, dear boy." "Well, when I got to New York, it looked like a decent sort of place to me, so I thought it would be a pretty sound notion to stop here. So I cabled to my uncle telling him that I had dropped into a good business wheeze in the city and wanted to chuck the ranch idea. He wrote back that it was all right, and here I've been ever since. He thinks I'm doing well at something or other over here. I never dreamed, don't you know, that he would ever come out here. What on earth am I to do?" "Jeeves," I said, "what on earth is Mr. Bickersteth to do?" "You see," said Bicky, "I had a wireless from him to say that he was coming to stay with me. To save hotel bills, I suppose. I've always given him the impression that I was living in pretty good style. I can't have him stay at my boarding-house." "Thought of anything, Jeeves?" I said. "To what extent, sir, if the question is not a delicate one, are you prepared to assist Mr. Bickersteth?" "I'll do anything I can for you, of course, Bicky, old man." "Then, if I might make the suggestion, sir, you might lend Mr. Bickersteth—" "No, by Jove," said Bicky firmly. "I never have touched you, Bertie, and I'm not going to start now. I may be a chump, but it's my boast that I don't owe a penny to a single soul, not counting tradesmen, of course. I was about to suggest, sir, that you might lend Mr. Bickersteth this flat. Mr. Bickersteth could give his Grace the impression that he was the owner of it. With your permission, I could convey the notion that I was in Mr. Bickersteth's employment, and not in yours. You would be residing here temporarily as Mr. Bickersteth's guest. His Grace would occupy the second spare bedroom. I fancy that you would find this answer satisfactorily, sir." Bicky had stopped rocking himself and was staring at Jeeves in an odd sort of way. "I would advocate the dispatching of a wireless message to His Grace on board the vessel, notifying him of the change of address. Mr. Bickersteth could meet His Grace at the dock, and proceed directly here. Will that meet the situation, sir?" "Absolutely." "Thank you, sir." Bicky followed him with his eye till the door closed. "How does he do it, Bertie?" he said. "I'll tell you what I think it is. I believe it's something to do with the shape of his head. Have you ever noticed his head, Bertie, old man? It sort of sticks out at the back." I hopped out of bed early next morning, so as to be among those present when the old boy should arrive. I knew from experience that these ocean liners fetch up at the dock at a deucedly ungodly hour. It wasn't much after 9 by the time I dressed and had my morning tea and was leaning out of the window, watching the street for Bicky and his uncle. It was one of those jolly, peaceful mornings that make a chappie wish he'd got a soul or something, and I was just brooding on life in general when I became aware of the dickens of a spate in progress down below. A taxi had driven up, and an old boy in a top hat had got out and was kicking up a frightful row about the fare. As far as I could make out, he was trying to get the cab chappie to switch from New York to London prices, and the cab chappie had apparently never heard of London before, and didn't seem to think a lot of it now. The old boy said that in London the trip would have set him back 8 pence, and the cabby said he should worry. I called to Jeeves. "The old Duke has arrived, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "That'll be him at the door now." Jeeves made a long arm and opened the front door, and the old boy crawled in, looking licked to a splinter. "How do you do, sir?" I said, bustling up and being the ray of sunshine. "Your nephew went down to the dock to meet you, but you must have missed him. My name's Wooster, don't you know? Great pal of Bicky's and all that sort of thing. I'm staying with him, you know. Would you like a cup of tea? Jeeves, bring a cup of tea." Old Chiswick had sunk into an armchair and was looking about the room. "Does this luxury flat belong to my nephew Francis?" "Absolutely." "It must be terribly expensive." "Pretty well, of course. Everything costs a lot over here, you know." He moaned. Jeeves filtered in with the tea. Old Chiswick took a stab at it to restore his tissues, and nodded. "A terrible country, Mr. Wooster. A terrible country. Nearly 8 shillings for a short cab drive. Iniquitous." He took another look around the room. It seemed to fascinate him. "Have you any idea how much my nephew pays for this flat, Mr. Wooster?" "About $200 a month, I believe." "What? £40 a month?" I began to see that, unless I made the thing a bit more plausible, the scheme might turn out a frost. I could guess what the old boy was thinking. He was trying to square all this prosperity with what he knew of poor old Bicky. And one had to admit that it took a lot of squaring, for dear old Bicky, though a stout fellow and absolutely unrivalled as an imitator of bull-terriers and cats, was in many ways one of the most pronounced fatheads that ever pulled on a suit of gents' underwear. "I suppose it seems rummy to you," I said, "but the fact is, New York often bucks chappies up and makes them show a flash of speed that you wouldn't have imagined them capable of. It sort of develops them. Something in the air, don't you know? I imagine that Bicky in the past, when you knew him, may have been something of a chump. But it's quite different now. Devilish efficient sort of chappie, and looked in on commercial circles as quite the nib." "I'm amazed. What is the nature of my nephew's business, Mr. Wooster?" "Oh, just business, don't you know? The same sort of thing Carnegie and Rockefeller and all those coves do, you know." I slid for the door. "Awfully sorry to leave you, but I've got to meet some of the lads elsewhere." Coming out of the lift, I met Bicky bustling in from the street. "Hello, Bertie. I missed him. Has he turned up?" "He's upstairs now, having some tea." "What does he think of it all?" "He's absolutely rattled." "Ripping. I'll be toddling up then. Toodaloo, Bertie, old man. See you later. Pip-pip, Bicky, dear boy." He trotted off, full of merriment and good cheer, and I went off to the club to sit in the window and watch the traffic coming up one way and going down the other. It was latish in the evening when I looked in at the flat to dress for dinner. "Where's everybody, Jeeves?" I said, finding no little feet pattering about the place. "Gone out?" "His Grace desired to see some of the sights of the city, sir. Mr. Bickersteth is acting as his escort. I fancy their immediate objective was Grant's tomb." "I suppose Mr. Bickersteth is a bit braced up the way things are going, what?" "Sir?" "I say, I take it that Mr. Bickersteth is tolerably full of beans." "Not altogether, sir." "What's his trouble now?" "The scheme which I took the liberty of suggesting to Mr. Bickersteth and yourself has, unfortunately, not answered entirely satisfactorily, sir." "Surely the Duke believes that Mr. Bickersteth is doing well in business, and all that sort of thing?" "Exactly, sir, with the result that he has decided to cancel Mr. Bickersteth's monthly allowance, on the ground that, as Mr. Bickersteth is doing so well on his own account, he no longer requires pecuniary assistance." "Great Scott, Jeeves, this is awful." "Somewhat disturbing, sir." "I never expected anything like this." "I confess I scarcely anticipated the contingency myself, sir." "I suppose it bowled the poor blighter over, absolutely." Mr. Bickersteth appeared somewhat taken aback, sir. My heart bled for Bicky. "We must do something, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "Can you think of anything?" "Not at the moment, sir." "There must be something we can do." "It was a maxim of one of my former employers, sir, as I believe I mentioned to you once before, the present Lord Bridgenorth, that there is always a way. I remember his lordship using the expression on the occasion— he was then a business gentleman, and had not yet received his title— when a patent hair restorer, which he chanced to be promoting, failed to attract the public. He put it on the market under another name, as a depilatory, and amassed a substantial fortune. I have generally found his lordship's aphorism based on sound foundations. No doubt we shall be able to discover some solution of Mr. Bickersteth's difficulty, sir." "Well, have a stab at it, Jeeves." "I will spare no pains, sir." I went and dressed sadly. It will show you pretty well how pipped I was when I tell you that I near as toucher put on a white tie with a dinner jacket. I sallied out for a bit of food more to pass the time than because I wanted it. It seemed brutal to be wading into the bill of fare with poor old Bicky headed for the breadline. When I got back, old Chiswick had gone to bed, but Bicky was there, hunched up in an armchair, brooding pretty intensely, with a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth and a more or less glassy stare in his eyes. He had the aspect of one who had been soaked with what the newspaper chappies called some blunt instrument. "This is a bit thick, old thing, what?" I said. He picked up his glass and drained it feverishly, overlooking the fact that it hadn't anything in it. "I'm done, Bertie," he said. He had another go at the glass. It didn't seem to do him any good. "If only this had happened a week later, Bertie. My next month's money was due to roll in on Saturday. I could have worked a wheeze I've been reading about in the magazine advertisements. It seems that you can make a dashed amount of money if you can only collect a few dollars and start a chicken farm." "Jolly sound scheme, Bertie. Say you buy a hen. Call it one hen for the sake of argument. It lays an egg every day of the week. You sell the eggs, 7 for 25 cents. Keep of hen costs nothing. Profit practically 25 cents on every 7 eggs. Or look at it another way. Suppose you have a dozen eggs. Each of the hens has a dozen chickens. The chickens grow up and have more chickens. Why, in no time you'd have the place covered knee-deep in hens, all laying eggs, at 25 cents for every 7. You'd make a fortune. Jolly life, too, keeping hens. He began to get quite worked up at the thought of it, but he slopped back in his chair at this juncture with a good deal of gloom. But, of course, it's no good, he said, because I haven't got the cash. You've only got to say the word, you know, Bicky, old top. Thanks awfully, Bertie, but I'm not going to sponge on you. That's always the way of this world. The chappies you'd like to lend money to won't let you, whereas the chappies you don't want to lend it to will do everything except actually stand on your head and lift the specie out of your pockets. As a lad who's always rolled tolerably free in the right stuff, I've had lots of experience of the second class. Many's the time, back in London, I've hurried along Piccadilly and felt the hot breath of a toucher on the back of my neck and heard his sharp, excited yapping as he closed in on me. I've simply spent my life scattering largesse to blighters I didn't care a hang for. Yet here I was now, dripping doubloons and pieces of 8, and longing to hand them over, and Bicky, poor fish, absolutely on his uppers, not taking any at any price. Well, there's only one hope, then. What's that? Jeeves, sir. There was Jeeves, standing behind me, full of zeal. In this matter of shimmering into rooms, the chappie is rummy to a degree. You're sitting in the old armchair, thinking of this and that, and then suddenly you look up, and there he is. He moves from point to point with as little uproar as a jellyfish. The thing startled poor old Bicky considerably. He rose from his seat like a rocketing pheasant. I'm used to Jeeves now, but often in the days when he first came into me I've bitten my tongue freely on finding him unexpectedly in my midst. "Did you call, sir?" "Oh, there you are, Jeeves." "Precisely, sir." "Jeeves, Mr. Bickersteth is still up the pole. Any ideas?" "Why, yes, sir. Since we had our recent conversation, I fancy I have found what may prove a solution. I do not wish to appear to be taking a liberty, sir, but I think that we have overlooked his Grace's potentialities as a source of revenue." Bicky laughed, what I have sometimes seen described as a hollow, mocking laugh, a sort of bitter cackle from the back of the throat, rather like a gargle. "I do not allude, sir," explained Jeeves, "to the possibility of inducing his Grace to part with money. I am taking the liberty of regarding his Grace in the light of an at present, if I may say so, useless property, which is capable of being developed." Bicky looked at me in a helpless kind of way. I'm bound to say I didn't get it myself. "Couldn't you make it a bit easier, Jeeves? In a nutshell, sir, what I mean is this. His Grace is, in a sense, a prominent personage. The inhabitants of this country, as no doubt you are aware, sir, are peculiarly addicted to shaking hands with prominent personages. It occurred to me that Mr. Bickersteth or yourself might know of persons who would be willing to pay a small fee, let us say $2 or $3, for the privilege of an introduction, including handshake, to his Grace." Bicky didn't seem to think much of it. "Do you mean to say that any one would be mug enough to part with solid cash just to shake hands with my uncle? I've an aunt, sir, who paid 5 shillings to a young fellow for bringing a moving picture actor to tea at her house one Sunday. It gave her social standing among the neighbours." Bicky wavered. "If you think it could be done, I feel convinced of it, sir." "What do you think, Bertie?" "I'm for it, old boy, absolutely. A very brainy wheeze." "Thank you, sir. Will there be anything further? Good night, sir." And he floated out, leaving us to discuss the details. Until we started this business of floating old Chiswick as a money-making proposition, I had never realized what a perfectly foul time those stock exchange chappies must have when the public isn't biting freely. Nowadays I read that bit they put in the financial reports about the market opened quietly with a sympathetic eye, for by Jove it certainly opened quietly for us. You'd hardly believe how difficult it was to interest the public and make them take a flutter on the old boy. By the end of the week, the only name we had on our list was a delicatessen store keeper down in Bicky's part of the town, and as he wanted us to take it out in sliced ham instead of cash, that didn't help much. There was a gleam of light when the brother of Bicky's pawnbroker offered $10, money down, for an introduction to old Chiswick, but the deal fell through, owing to its turning out that the chap was an anarchist, and intended to kick the old boy instead of shaking hands with him. At that, it took me the deuce of a time to persuade Bicky not to grab the cash and let things take their course. He seemed to regard the pawnbroker's brother rather as a sportsman and benefactor of his species than otherwise. The whole thing, I'm inclined to think, would have been off if it hadn't been for Jeeves. There is no doubt that Jeeves is in a class of his own. In the matter of brain and resource, I don't think I have ever met a chappie so supremely like Mother Maid. He trickled into my room one morning with a good old cup of tea, and intimated that there was something doing. "Might I speak to you with regard to the matter of his Grace, sir?" "It's all off. We've decided to chuck it." "Sir?" "It won't work. We can't get anybody to come." "I fancy I can arrange that aspect of the matter, sir." "Do you mean to say you've managed to get anybody?" "Yes, sir. 87 gentlemen from Birdsburg, sir." I sat up in bed and spilt the tea. "Birdsburg?" "Birdsburg, Missouri, sir." "How did you get them?" "I happened last night, sir, as you had intimated that you would be absent from home, to attend a theatrical performance, and entered into conversation between the acts with the occupant of the adjoining seat. I had observed that he was wearing a somewhat ornate decoration in his buttonhole, sir, a large blue button with the words "Boost for Birdsburg" on it in red letters, scarcely a judicious addition to a gentleman's evening costume. To my surprise, I noticed that the auditorium was full of persons similarly decorated. I ventured to inquire the explanation, and was informed that these gentlemen, forming a party of 87, are a convention from a town of the name of Birdsburg. I ventured to inquire the explanation, and was informed that these gentlemen, forming a party of 87, are a convention from a town of the name of Birdsburg in the state of Missouri. Their visit, I gathered, was purely of a social and pleasurable nature, and my informant spoke at some length of the entertainments arranged for their stay in the city. It was when he related with a considerable amount of satisfaction and pride that a deputation of their number had been introduced to and had shaken hands with a well-known prize-fighter, that it occurred to me to broach the subject of his Grace. To make a long story short, sir, I have arranged, subject to your approval, that the entire convention shall be presented to his Grace tomorrow afternoon. I was amazed. This chappie was a Napoleon. 87, Jeeves? At how much a head? I was obliged to agree to a reduction for quantity, sir. The terms finally arrived at were $150 for the party. I thought a bit. Payable in advance? No, sir. I endeavored to obtain payment in advance, but was not successful. Well, anyway, when we get it, I'll make it up to 500. Bicky'll never know. Do you suspect Mr. Bickersteth would suspect anything, Jeeves, if I made it up to 500? I fancy not, sir. Mr. Bickersteth is an agreeable gentleman, but not bright. All right, then. After breakfast, run down to the bank and get me some money. Yes, sir. You know, you're a bit of a marvel, Jeeves. Thank you, sir. Righto. Very good, sir. When I took dear old Bicky aside in the course of the morning and told him what had happened, he nearly broke down. He tottered into the sitting-room and buttonholed old Chiswick, who was reading the comic section of the morning paper with a kind of grim resolution. "Uncle," he said, "are you doing anything special tomorrow afternoon? I mean to say, I've asked a few of my pals in to meet you, don't you know?" The old boy cocked a speculative eye at him. "There will be no reporters among them." "Reporters? Rather not. Why?" "I refuse to be badgered by reporters. There were a number of adhesive young men who endeavored to elicit from me my views on America while the boat was approaching the dock. I will not be subjected to this persecution again." "That'll be absolutely all right, Uncle. There won't be a newspaper man in the place. In that case, I shall be glad to make the acquaintance of your friends." "You'll shake hands with them and so forth?" "I shall naturally order my behavior according to the accepted rules of civilized intercourse." Bicky thanked him heartily and came off to lunch with me at the club, where he babbled freely of hens, incubators, and other rotten things. After mature consideration, we had decided to unleash the Birdsburg contingent on the old boy 10 at a time. Jeeves brought his theater pal round to see us, and we arranged the whole thing with him. A very decent chappie, but rather inclined to colour the conversation and turn it in the direction of his hometown's new water supply system. We settled that, as an hour was about all he would be likely to stand, each gang should consider itself entitled to 7 minutes of the Duke's society by Jeeves' stopwatch, and that when their time was up, Jeeves would slide into the room and cough meaningly. Then we parted with what I believe are called mutual expressions of goodwill, the Birdsburg chappie extending a cordial invitation to us all to pop out some day and take a look at the new water supply system, for which we thanked him. Next day the deputation rolled in. The first shift consisted of the cove we had met and 9 others almost exactly like him in every respect. They all looked deuced keen and businesslike, as if from youth up they had been working in the office and catching the boss's eye and what not. They shook hands with the old boy with a good deal of apparent satisfaction, all except one chappie who seemed to be brooding about something, and then they stood off and became chatty. "What message have you for Birdsburg, Duke?" asked our pal. The old boy seemed a bit rattled. "I have never been to Birdsburg." Chappie seemed pained. "You should pay it a visit," he said. "The most rapidly growing city in the country. Boost for Birdsburg." "Boost for Birdsburg," said the other chappies reverently. The chappie who had been brooding suddenly gave tongue. "Say!" He was a stout sort of well-fed cove with one of those determined chins and a cold eye. The assemblage looked at him. "As a matter of business," said the chappie, "mind you, I'm not questioning anybody's good faith, but as a matter of strict business, I think this gentleman here ought to put himself on record before witnesses as stating that he really is a duke." "What do you mean, sir?" cried the old boy, getting purple. "No offense, simply business. I'm not saying anything, mind you, but there's one thing that seems kind of funny to me. This gentleman here says his name's Mr. Bickersteth, as I understand it. Well, if you're the Duke of Chiswick, why isn't he Lord Percy something? I've read English novels, and I know all about it." "This is monstrous." "Now, don't get hot under the collar. I'm only asking. I have a right to know. You're going to take our money, so it's only fair that we should see that we get our money's worth." The water supply cove chipped in. "You're quite right, Sims. I overlooked that when making the agreement. You see, gentlemen, as businessmen, we've a right to reasonable guarantees of good faith. We're paying Mr. Bickersteth here $150 for this reception, and we naturally want to know." Old Chiswick gave Bicky a searching look. Then he turned to the water supply chappie. He was frightfully calm. "I can assure you that I know nothing of this," he said, quite politely. "I should be grateful if you would explain." "Well, we arranged with Mr. Bickersteth that 87 citizens of Birdsburg should have the privilege of meeting and shaking hands with you for a financial consideration mutually arranged, and what my friend Sims here means, and I'm with him, is that we have only Mr. Bickersteth's word for it, and he is a stranger to us, that you are the Duke of Chiswick at all." Old Chiswick gulped. "Allow me to assure you, sir," he said in a rummy kind of voice, "that I am the Duke of Chiswick." "Then that's all right," said the chappie heartily. That was all we wanted to know. Let the thing go on." "I am sorry to say," said old Chiswick, "that it cannot go on. I am feeling a little tired. I fear I must ask to be excused." "But there are 87 of the boys waiting around the corner at this moment, Duke, to be introduced to you." "I fear I must disappoint them." "But in that case the deal would have to be off." "That is a matter for you and my nephew to discuss." The chappie seemed troubled. "You really won't meet the rest of them?" "No." "Well then, I guess we'll be going." They went out, and there was a pretty solid silence. Then old Chiswick turned to Bicky. "Well?" Bicky didn't seem to have anything to say. "Was it true what that man said?" "Yes, uncle." "What do you mean by playing this trick?" Bicky seemed pretty well knocked out, so I put in a word. "I think you better explain the whole thing, Bicky, old top." Bicky's Adam's apple jumped about a bit, then he started. "You see, you had cut off my allowance, uncle, and I wanted a bit of money to start a chicken farm. I mean to say, it's an absolute cert if you once get a bit of capital. You buy a hen, and it lays an egg every day of the week, and you sell the eggs, say 7 for 25 cents. Keep of the hens costs nothing, profit practically. What is all this nonsense about hens? You led me to suppose you were a substantial businessman." "Old Bicky rather exaggerated, sir," I said, helping the chappie out. "The fact is, the poor old lad is absolutely dependent on that remittance of yours, and when you cut it off, don't you know, he was pretty solidly in the soup, and had to think of some way of closing in on a bit of the ready pretty quick. That's why we thought of this handshaking scheme." Old Chiswick foamed at the mouth. "So you have lied to me. You have deliberately deceived me as to your financial status." "Poor old Bicky didn't want to go to that ranch," I explained. "He doesn't like cows and horses, but he rather thinks he would be hot stuff among the hens. All he wants is a bit of capital. Don't you think it would be rather a wheeze if you were to, after what has happened? After this deceit and foolery? Not a penny." "But—" "Not a penny!" There was a respectful cough in the background. "If I might make a suggestion, sir." Jeeves was standing on the horizon, looking devilish brainy. "Go ahead, Jeeves," I said. "I would merely suggest, sir, that if Mr. Bickersteth is in need of a little ready money, and is at a loss to obtain it elsewhere, he might secure the sum he requires by describing the occurrences of this afternoon for the Sunday issue of one of the more spirited and enterprising newspapers." "By Jove!" I said. "By George!" said Bicky. "Great heavens!" said old Chiswick. "Very good, sir," said Jeeves. Bicky turned to old Chiswick with a gleaming eye. "Jeeves is right. I'll do it. The Chronicle would jump at it. They eat that sort of stuff." Old Chiswick gave a kind of moaning howl. "I absolutely forbid you, Francis, to do this thing." "That's all very well," said Bicky, wonderfully braced, "but if I can't get the money any other way—" "Wait! Wait, my boy. You are so impetuous. We might arrange something." "I won't go to that bally ranch." No, my boy. I would not suggest it. I would not for a moment suggest it. I think—" He seemed to have a bit of a struggle with himself. I think that, on the whole, it would be best if you returned with me to England. I might— In fact, I think I see my way I might be able to utilize your services in some secretarial position." "I shouldn't mind that." "I should not be able to offer you a salary, but as you know, in English political life, the unpaid secretary is a recognized figure." "The only figure I'll recognize," said Bicky firmly, "is 500 quid a year, paid quarterly." "My dear boy!" "Absolutely. But your recompense, my dear Francis, would consist in the unrivaled opportunities you would have, as my secretary, to gain experience, to accustom yourself to the intricacies of political life, in fact, you would be in an exceedingly advantageous position." "$500 a year," said Bicky, rolling it round his tongue. "Why, that would be nothing to what I could make if I started a chicken farm. It stands to reason. Suppose you have a dozen hens. Each of the hens has a dozen chickens. After a bit the chickens grow up and have a dozen chickens each themselves, and then they all start laying eggs. There's a fortune in it. You can get anything you like for eggs in America. Chappies keep them on ice for years and don't sell them till they fetch about $1 a whirl. You'd think I'm going to chuck a future like this for anything under 500 goblins a year? What?" A look of anguish passed over old Chiswick's face. Then he seemed to be resigned to it. "Very well, my boy," he said. "What-ho," said Bicky. "All right, then." "Jeeves," I said. Bicky had taken the old boy off to dinner to celebrate, and we were alone. "Jeeves, this has been one of your best efforts." "Thank you, sir." "It beats me how you do it." "Yes, sir." "The only trouble is, you haven't got much out of it, what?" I fancy Mr. Bickersteth intends, I judge from his remarks, to signify his appreciation of anything I have been fortunate enough to do to assist him at some later date when he is in a more favourable position to do so. "It isn't enough, Jeeves." "Sir?" It was a wrench, but I felt it was the only possible thing to be done. "Bring my shaving things." A gleam of hope shone in the chappie's eyes, mixed with doubt. "You mean, sir, and shave off my moustache." There was a moment's silence. I could see the fellow was deeply moved. "Thank you very much indeed, sir," he said in a low voice, and popped off. End of Jeeves and the Hard-Boiled Egg. My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. 4. Absent Treatment. I want to tell you all about my dear old Bobby Cardew. It's a most interesting story. I can't put in any literary style and all that, but I don't have to, don't you know, because it goes on its moral lesson. If you're a man, you mustn't miss it, because it'll be a warning to you. And if you're a woman, you won't want to, because it's all about how a girl made a man feel pretty well fed up with things. If you're a recent acquaintance of Bobby's, you'll probably be surprised to hear that there was a time when he was more remarkable for the weakness of his memory than anything else. Dozens of fellows who have only met Bobby once since the change took place have been surprised when I told them that. Yes, it's true. Believe me. In the days when I first knew him, Bobby Cardew was about the most pronounced young rotter inside the 4-mile radius. People have called me a silly ass, but I was never in the same class with Bobby. When it came to being a silly ass, he was a +4 man, while my handicap was about 6. Why, if I wanted him to dine with me, I used to post him a letter at the beginning of the week, and then the day before send him a telegram and a phone call on the day itself, and, half an hour before the time we'd fixed, a messenger in a taxi, whose business it was to see that he got in and that the chauffeur had the address all correct. By doing this I generally managed to get him, unless he had left town before my messenger arrived. The funny thing was that he wasn't altogether a fool in other ways. Deep down in him there was a kind of stratum of sense. I had known him once or twice show an almost human intelligence. But to reach that stratum, mind you, you needed dynamite. At least, that's what I thought. But there was another way which hadn't occurred to me. Marriage, I mean. Marriage, the dynamite of the soul. That was what hit Bobby. He married. Have you ever seen a bull pup chasing a bee? The pup sees the bee, it looks good to him, but he still doesn't know what's at the end of it till he gets there. It was like that with Bobby. He fell in love, got married with a sort of whoop, as if it were the greatest fun in the world, and then began to find out things. She wasn't the sort of girl you would have expected Bobby to rave about, and yet, I don't know. What I mean is, she worked for her living, and to a fellow who has never done a hand's turn in his life, There's undoubtedly a sort of fascination, a kind of romance about a girl who works for her living. Her name was Anthony. Mary Anthony. She was about 5'6". She had 1.5 tons of red gold hair, gray eyes, and one of those determined chins. She was a hospital nurse. When Bobby smashed himself up at polo, she was told off by the authorities to smooth his brow and rally round with cooling unguents and all like that. And the old boy hadn't been up and about again for more than a week before they'd popped off to the registrars and fixed it up. Quite the romance. Bobby broke the news to me at the club one evening, and the next day he introduced me to her. I admired her. I've never worked myself. My name's Pepper, by the way. Almost forgot to mention it. Reggie Pepper. My Uncle Edward was Pepper, Wells and Company, the colliery people. He left me a sizable chunk of bullion. I say I've never worked myself, but I admire anyone who earns a living under difficulties, especially a girl. And this girl had a rather unusual time of it, being an orphan and all that, and having had to do everything off her own bat for years. Mary and I got along splendidly. We don't now, but we'll come to that later. I'm speaking of the past. She seemed to think Bobby the greatest thing on earth, judging by the way she looked at him when she thought I wasn't noticing, and Bobby seemed to think the same about her. So that I came to the conclusion that, if only dear old Bobby didn't forget to go to the wedding, they had a sporting chance of being quite happy. Well, let's brisk it up a bit here and jump a year. The story doesn't really start till then. They took a flat and settled down. I was in and out of the place quite a good deal. I kept my eyes open, and everything seemed to me to be running along as smoothly as you could want. If this was marriage, I thought, I couldn't see why fellows were so frightened of it. There were a lot worse things that could happen to a man. But we now come to the incident of the quiet dinner, and it's just here that love's young dream hits a snag, and things begin to occur. I happened to meet Bobby in Piccadilly, and he asked me to come back to dinner at the flat. And, like a fool, instead of bolting and putting myself under police protection, I went. When we got to the flat, there was Mrs. Bobby looking, well, I tell you, it staggered me. Her gold hair was all piled up in waves and crinkles and things, with a what-you-call-it of diamonds in it, and she was wearing the most perfectly ripping dress. I couldn't begin to describe it. I can only say it was the limit. It struck me that if this was how she was in the habit of looking every night when they were dining quietly at home together, it was no wonder that Bobby liked domesticity. "Here's old Reggie, dear," said Bobby. "I brought him home to have a bit of dinner. I'll phone down to the kitchen and ask them to send it up now, what?" She stared at him as if she had never seen him before. Then she turned scarlet. Then she turned white as a sheet. Then she gave a little laugh. It was most interesting to watch. Made me wish I was up a tree about 800 miles away. Then she recovered herself. "I'm so glad you were able to come, Mr. Pepper," she said, smiling at me. And after that she was all right. At least you would have said so. She talked a lot at dinner and chaffed Bobby, and played us ragtime on the piano afterwards, as if she hadn't a care in the world. Quite a jolly little party it was. Not. I'm no lynx-eyed sleuth and all that sort of thing, but I had seen her face at the beginning, and I knew that she was working the whole time and working hard to keep herself in hand, and that she would have given that diamond what's-its-name in her hair and everything else she possessed to have one good scream, just one. I've sat through some pretty thick evenings in my time, but that one had the rest beaten in a canter. At the very earliest moment I grabbed my hat and got away. Having seen what I did, I wasn't particularly surprised to meet Bobby at the club next day, looking about as merry and bright as a lonely gumdrop at an Eskimo tea party. We started in straight away. He seemed glad to have someone to talk about it. "Do you know how long I've been married?" he said. I didn't exactly. "About a year, isn't it?" "Not about a year," he said sadly. "Exactly a year. Yesterday." Then I understood. I saw a light, a regular flash of light. Yesterday was the anniversary of the wedding. I'd arranged to take Mary to the Savoy and on to Covent Garden. She particularly wanted to hear Caruso. I had the ticket for the box in my pocket. Do you know, all through dinner I had a kind of rummy idea that there was something I'd forgotten, but I couldn't think what. Till your wife mentioned it? He nodded. She mentioned it, he said thoughtfully. I didn't ask for details. Women with hair and chins like Mary's may be angels most of the time, but when they take off their wings for a bit, they aren't half-hearted about it. To be absolutely frank, old top, said poor old Bobby, in a broken sort of way, my stock's pretty low at home. There didn't seem much to be done. I just lit a cigarette and sat there. He didn't want to talk. Presently he went out. I stood at the window of our upper smoking room, which looks out onto Piccadilly, and watched him. He walked slowly along for a few yards, stopped, then walked on again, and finally turned into a jeweler's. Which is an instant of what I mean when I say that deep down in him there was a certain stratum of sense. It was from now on that I began to be really interested in this problem of Bobby's married life. Of course, one's always mildly interested in one's friends' marriages, hoping they'll turn out well and all that, but this was different. The average man isn't like Bobby, and the average girl isn't like Mary. It was like that old business of the immovable mass and the irresistible force. There was Bobby, ambling gently through life, a dear old chap in 100 ways, but undoubtedly a chump of the first water. And there was Mary, determined that he shouldn't be a chump. And nature, mind you, on Bobby's side. When nature makes a chump like dear old Bobby, she's proud of him, and doesn't want her handiwork disturbed. She gives him a sort of natural armor to protect him against outside interference. And that armor is shortness of memory. Shortness of memory keeps a man a chump, when, but for it, he might cease to be one. Take my case, for instance. I'm a chump. Well, if I had remembered half the things people have tried to teach me during my life, my size in hats would be about number 9. But I didn't. I forgot them. And it was just the same with Bobby. For about a week, perhaps a bit more, the recollection of that quiet little domestic evening bucked him up like a tonic. Elephants, I read somewhere, are champions at the memory business, but they were fools to Bobby during that week. But, bless you, the shock wasn't nearly big enough. It had dinted the armor, but it hadn't made a hole in it. Pretty soon he was back at the old game. It was pathetic, don't you know? The poor girl loved him, and she was frightened. It was the thin edge of the wedge, you see, and she knew it. A man who forgets what day he was married, when he's been married 1 year, will forget, at about the end of the 4th, that he's married at all. If she meant to get him in hand at all, she had got to do it now, before he began to drift away. I saw that clearly enough, and I tried to make Bobby see it, when he was by way of pouring out his troubles to me one afternoon. I can't remember what it was that he had forgotten the day before, but it was something she had asked him to bring home for her. It may have been a book. "It's such a little thing to fuss about," said Bobby, "and she knows it simply because I've got such an infernal memory about everything. I can't remember anything. Never could." He talked on for a while, and just as he was going, he pulled out a couple of sovereigns. "Oh, by the way," he said. "What's this for?" I asked, though I knew. "I owe it to you." "How's that?" I said. "Why, that bet on Tuesday. In the billiard room? Murray and Brown were playing 100 up, and I gave you 2-1 that Brown would win, and Murray beat him by 20 odd. "So you do remember some things," I said. He got quite excited. Said that if I thought he was the sort of rotter who forgot to pay when he lost a bet, It was pretty rotten of me after knowing him all these years, and a lot more like that. "Subside, laddie," I said. Then I spoke to him like a father. "What you've got to do, my old college chum," I said, "is to pull yourself together, and jolly quick, too. As things are shaping, you're due for a nasty knock before you know what's hit you. You've got to make an effort. Don't say you can't. This 2 quid business shows that, even if your memory is rocky, you can remember some things. What you've got to do is to see that wedding anniversaries and so on are included on the list. It may be a brain strain, but you can't get out of it." "I suppose you're right," said Bobby, "but it beats me why she thinks such a lot of these rotten little dates. What's it matter if I forgot what day we were married on, or what day she was born on, or what day the cat had the measles? She knows I love her just as much as if I were a memorizing freak at the halls." "That's not enough for a woman," I said. "They want to be shown. Bear that in mind, and you'll be all right. Forget it, and there'll be trouble." He chewed the knob of his stick. "Women are frightfully rummy," he said gloomily. "You should have thought of that before you married one," I said. I don't see that I could have done any more. I'd put the whole thing in a nutshell for him. You would have thought he would have seen the point, and that it would have made him brace up and get a hold of himself. But no. Off he went again in the same old way. I gave up arguing with him. I had a good deal of time on my hands, but not enough to amount to anything when it was a question of reforming dear old Bobby by argument. If you see a man asking for trouble, and insisting on getting it, the only thing to do is to stand by and wait till it comes to him. After that you may get a chance. But till then there's nothing to be done. But I thought a lot about him. Bobby didn't get into the soup all at once. Weeks went by, and months, and still nothing happened. Now and then he'd come into the club with a kind of cloud on his shiny morning face, and I'd known that there had been doings in the home. But it wasn't till well on in the spring that he got the thunderbolt, just where he'd been asking for it, in the thorax. I was smoking a quiet cigarette one morning on the window looking out over Piccadilly, and watching the buses and motors going up one way and down the other. Most interesting it is, I often do it, when in rushed Bobby, with his eyes bulging and his face the color of an oyster, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "Reggie," he said. "Reggie, old top, she's gone." "Gone," I said. "Who?" "Mary, of course. Gone. Left me. Gone." "Where?" I said. Silly question? Perhaps you're right. Anyhow, dear old Bobby nearly foamed at the mouth. "Where? How should I know where? Here, read this." He pushed the paper into my hand. It was a letter. "Go on," said Bobby. "Read it." So I did. It certainly was quite a letter. There was not much of it, but it was all to the point. This is what it said. "My dear Bobby, I am going away. When you care enough about me to remember to wish me many happy returns on my birthday, I will come back. My address will be Box 341, London Morning News." I read it twice. Then I said, "Well, why don't you?" "Why don't I what?" "Why don't you wish her many happy returns? It doesn't seem much to ask." "But she says on her birthday." "Well, when is her birthday?" "Can't you understand?" said Bobby. "I've forgotten." "Forgotten?" I said. "Yes," said Bobby. "Forgotten." "What do you mean, forgotten?" I said. "Forgotten whether it's the 20th or the 21st, or what? How near do you get to it?" "I know it came somewhere between the 1st of January and the 31st of December. That's how near I get to it." "Think." "Think? What's the use of saying think? Think I haven't thought? I've been knocking sparks out of my brain ever since I opened that letter." "And you can't remember?" "No." I rang the bell and ordered restoratives. "Well, Bobby," I said, "it's a pretty hard case to spring on an untrained amateur like me. Suppose someone had come to Sherlock Holmes and said, "Mr. Holmes, here's a case for you. When is my wife's birthday?" Wouldn't that have given Sherlock a jolt? However, I know enough about the game to understand that a fellow can't shoot off his deductive theories unless you start him with a clue. So rouse yourself out of that pop-eyed trance and come across with 2 or 3. For instance, can't you remember the last time she had a birthday? What sort of weather was it? That might fix the month. Bobby shook his head. It was just ordinary weather as near as I can recollect. Warm? Warmish. Or cold? Well, fairly cold, perhaps. I can't remember. I ordered 2 more of the same. They seemed indicated in the young detective's manual. "You're a great help, Bobby," I said. "An invaluable assistant. One of those indispensable adjuncts without which no home is complete." Bobby seemed to be thinking. "I've got it," he said suddenly. "Look here. I gave her a present on her last birthday. All we have to do is go to the shop, hunt up the date when it was bought, and the thing's done." "Absolutely. What did you give her?" He sagged. "I can't remember," he said. Getting ideas is like golf. Some days you're right off. Others it's as easy as falling off a log. I don't suppose dear old Bobby had ever had 2 ideas in the same morning before in his life. But now he did it without an effort. He just loosed another dry martini into the undergrowth, and before you could turn around, it had flushed quite a brainwave. Do you know those little books called When You Were Born? There's one for each month. They tell you your character, your talents, your strong points, and your weak points at 4 halfpenny a go. Bobby's idea was to buy the whole 12 and go through them till we found out which month hit off Mary's character. That would give us the month, and narrow it down a whole lot. A pretty hot idea for a non-thinker like dear old Bobby. We sallied out at once. He took half, and I took half, and we settled down to work. As I say, it sounded good, but when we came into the thing, we saw that there was a flaw. There was plenty of information, all right, but there wasn't a single month that didn't have something that exactly hit off Mary. For instance, in the December book it said, "December people are apt to keep their own secrets. They are extensive travelers." Well, Mary had certainly kept her secret, and she had traveled quite extensively enough for Bobby's needs. Then October people were born with original ideas and loved moving. You couldn't have summed up Mary's little jaunt more neatly. February people had wonderful memories, Mary's speciality. We took a bit of a rest, then had another go at the thing. Bobby was all for May, because the book said that women born in that month were inclined to be capricious, which is always a barrier to a happy married life. But I plumped for February, because February women are unusually determined to have their own way, are very earnest, and expect a full return in their companion or mates. Which he owned was about as like Mary as anything could be. In the end he tore the books up, stamped on them, burnt them, and went home. It was wonderful what a change the next few days made in dear old Bobby. Have you ever seen that picture, The Soul's Awakening? It represents a flapper of sorts, gazing in a startled sort of way into the middle distance, with a look in her eyes that seems to say, "Surely that is George's step I hear on the mat. Can this be love?" Well, Bobby had a soul's awakening too. I don't suppose he had ever troubled to think in his life before, not really think. But now he was wearing his brain to the bone. It was painful in a way, of course, to see a fellow human being so thoroughly in the soup, and I felt strongly that it was all for the best. I could see as plainly as possible that all these brainstorms were improving Bobby out of knowledge. When it was all over, he might possibly become a rotter again of a sort, but it would only be a pale reflection of the rotter he had been. It bore out the idea I had always had that what he needed was a really good jolt. I saw a great deal of him these days. I was his best friend, and he came to me for sympathy. I gave it to him, too, with both hands, but I never failed to hand him the moral lesson when I had him weak. One day he came to me as I was sitting in the club, and I could see that he had had an idea. He looked happier than he'd done in weeks. "Reggie," he said, "I'm on the trail. This time I'm convinced that I shall pull it off. I've remembered something of vital importance." "Yes?" I said. "I remember distinctly," he said, "that on Mary's last birthday we went together to the Colosseum. How does that hit you?" "It's a fine bit of memorizing," I said, "but how does it help?" "Why, they change the program every week there." "Ah," I said, "now you're talking." "And the week we went, one of the turns was Professor Someone's Terpsichorean cats. I recollect them distinctly. Now, are we narrowing it down, or aren't we, Reggie? I'm going round to the Colosseum this minute, and I'm going to dig the date of those Terpsichorean cats out of them if I have to use a crowbar." So that got him within 6 days, for the management treated us like brothers, brought out the archives, and ran agile fingers over the pages till they treed the cats in the middle of May. "I told you it was May," said Bobby. "Maybe you'll listen to me another time." "If you've any sense," I said, "there won't be another time." And Bobby said that there wouldn't. Once you get your money on the run, it parts as if it enjoyed doing it. I had just got off to sleep that night when my telephone bell rang. It was Bobby, of course. He didn't apologize. "Reggie," he said, "I've got it now for certain. It's just come to me. We saw those Terpsichorean cats at a matinee, old man." "Yes?" I said. "Well, don't you see that brings it down to 2 days? It must have been either Wednesday the 7th or Saturday the 10th. "Yes," I said, "if they didn't have daily matinees at the Colosseum." I heard him give a sort of howl. "Bobby," I said. My feet were freezing, but I was fond of him. "Well?" "I've remembered something, too. It's this. The day you went to the Colosseum, I lunched with you both at the Ritz. You had forgotten to bring any money with you, so you wrote a check." "But I'm always writing checks." "You are, but this was for a tenner, and made out to the hotel. Hunt up your checkbook and see how many checks for £10 payable to the Ritz Hotel you wrote out between May the 5th and May the 10th. He gave a kind of gulp. "Reggie," he said, "you're a genius. I've always said so. I believe you've got it. Hold the line." Presently he came back again. "Hello," he said. "I'm here," I said. It was the 8th. "Reggie, old man, Topping," I said. "Good night." It was working along into the small hours now, but I thought I might as well make a night of it and finish the thing up, so I rang up an hotel near the Strand. "Put me through to Mrs. Cardew," I said. "It's late," said the man at the other end. "And getting later every minute," I said. "Buck along, laddie." I waited patiently. I had missed my beauty sleep, and my feet had frozen hard, but I was past regrets. "What is the matter?" said Mary's voice. "My feet are cold," I said, "but I didn't call you up to tell you that particularly. I've just been chatting with Bobby, Mrs. Cardew." "Oh, is that Mr. Pepper?" "Yes. He's remembered it, Mrs. Cardew." She gave a sort of scream. I've often thought how interesting it must be to be one of those exchange girls. The things they must hear, don't you know? Bobby's howl and gulp, and Mrs. Bobby's scream, and all about my feet and all that. Most interesting it must be. "He's remembered it," she gasped. "Did you tell him?" "No." Well, I hadn't. "Mr. Pepper." "Yes." Was he very worried?" I chuckled. This was where I was billed to be the life and soul of the party. "Worried? He was about the most worried man between here and Edinburgh. He has been worrying as if he was paid to do it by the nation. He has started out to worry after breakfast, and— oh, well, you can never tell with women. My idea was that we should pass the rest of the night slapping each other on the back across the wire, and telling each other what bally-brainy conspirators we were, don't you know, and all that. But I'd got just as far as this when she bit at me. Absolutely. I heard the snap. And then she said, 'Oh,' in that choked kind of way. And when a woman says "oh" like that, it means all the bad words she loved to say if she only knew them. And then she began. "What brutes men are! What horrible brutes! How could you stand by and see poor dear Bobby worrying himself into a fever when a word from you would have put everything right? I can't— But, and you call yourself his friend. His friend!" Metallic laugh, most unpleasant. "It shows how one can be deceived. I used to think you a kind-hearted man. But, I say, when I suggested the thing you thought it perfectly— I thought it hateful, abominable. But you said it was absolutely top— I said nothing of the kind, and if I did, I didn't mean it. I don't wish to be unjust, Mr. Pepper, but I must say that to me there seems to be something positively fiendish in a man who could go out of his way to separate a husband from his wife, simply in order to amuse himself by gloating over his agony. But when one single word would have— But you made me promise not to," I bleated. "And if I did, do you suppose I didn't expect you to have the sense to break your promise?" I had finished. I had no further observations to make. I hung up the receiver and crawled into bed. I still see Bobby when he comes to the club, but I do not visit the old homestead. He is friendly, but he stops short of issuing invitations. I ran across Mary at the academy last week, and her eyes went through me like a couple of bullets through a pat of butter, and as they came out the other side, and I limped off to piece myself together again, there occurred to me the simple epitaph which, when I am no more, I intend to have inscribed on my tombstone. It was this: "He was a man who acted from the best motives. There is one born every minute." End of Absent Treatment.